The Hargrove estate sat on 40 acres of manicured Connecticut countryside, a monument to everything that money could buy and everything it couldn't. At 33, Ethan Hargrove had more wealth than he could spend in 3 lifetimes, a tech empire worth $12 billion, a name that appeared on magazine covers, and a life that looked, from the outside, like the very definition of success. But inside those 40 acres, inside those marble hallways and cathedral ceilings and rooms that echoed because no one filled them, Ethan Hargrove was just a man carrying a grief so heavy it had bent the shape of him. He woke at 5 every morning not because he wanted to, but because sleep had become something that happened to other people. He'd lie in the dark of his master suite, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of a house that had once held laughter. His mother had died when he was 26. His father, the original Hargrove, the man who built the foundation Ethan had turned into an empire, had followed 2 years later. And then there was the loss he never talked about. The one that lived in the locked drawer of his nightstand. The one that had turned him from a man who laughed easily into a man who barely smiled at all. His staff knew better than to ask about it. Over the years, they'd learned the architecture of his silence, which rooms he avoided, which subjects made his jaw tighten, which mornings were worse than others. He was fair to them, even generous, by any reasonable standard. But he was not warm. Warmth, somewhere along the way, had become a luxury he decided he couldn't afford. The morning that would change everything began like all the others. Ethan was in his study by 5:30, coffee untouched, eyes scanning quarterly reports he'd already memorized. The early March light was just beginning to push through the tall windows, gray and thin, the kind of light that felt like an apology. He heard the side entrance open, the staff entrance, and the familiar, quiet sounds of the morning crew beginning their work. He didn't look up. He never did. What he didn't know was that today, one of those quiet morning sounds was different. His longtime head of household, Mrs. Patterson, had arranged a temporary replacement for their regular daytime housekeeper, Maria, who'd had a family emergency. The replacement was her niece, a young woman named Clara Reyes, and Clara had a problem that Mrs. Patterson had, with some hesitation, agreed to accommodate for just one day. She had nowhere to leave her 3-year-old daughter. "She'll stay in the kitchen quarters. Mr. Hargrove will never even know," Mrs. Patterson had told herself firmly. She'd set up a little corner with a blanket and some toys, and Clara's daughter, a tiny, dark-haired girl named Lily, had settled in with a quiet contentment that very young children sometimes have, as though the world is simply whatever room they're currently in. Ethan didn't know any of this at 7 in the morning when he rose from his desk and walked to the kitchen for a second cup of coffee. He moved through the hallways like a man on autopilot, his mind still buried in numbers, in projections, in the clean and reliable logic of business. He pushed open the kitchen door, reached for the coffee carafe without really looking at anything, and then stopped. There was a sound. It was small, barely anything. A soft humming, tuneless and sweet, the way a very small child hums when they're perfectly happy and completely unaware of the world watching them. Ethan's hand went still on the carafe. He turned slowly, as though moving too fast might break something. In the corner of his kitchen, on a folded blanket between the pantry door and the tall window that overlooked the garden, sat the smallest person he had ever seen in this house. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Dark curls framed a round, serious little face, and she was deeply, completely absorbed in lining up a collection of small plastic animals along the baseboard, a zebra, a bear, a tiny orange giraffe. She was humming as she worked, adjusting the giraffe's position with the focused precision of a sculptor. Ethan stood perfectly still. Something was happening in his chest, a shifting like tectonic plates, slow and enormous and impossible to stop. He should have turned around. He should have found Mrs. Patterson, asked a quiet question, returned to his study. That was what the version of himself he'd constructed over 7 years would have done. Instead, he stood there watching a 3-year-old arrange plastic animals, and he couldn't move. Not because of her face, though she was lovely. Not because of the humming, though it was doing something strange to the air in the room. He couldn't move because of what was hanging around her tiny neck, a thin gold chain, age-worn and delicate, and at the end of it a pendant. A crescent moon, small as a thumbnail, with a single chip of blue topaz at its center. Ethan's coffee mug hit the marble counter with a crack that shattered the morning silence. The little girl looked up, startled, her dark eyes going wide. She stared at him, this tall, frozen, pale man, with the fearless curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid of powerful people. "Hi," she said. The word hit him like a physical force. 1 syllable. 2 letters. And everything he had spent 7 years building around his heart began, in that single moment, to crack. Because that pendant, that exact pendant, crescent moon, blue topaz chip, gold chain worn thin with years, had belonged to a woman named Sophie. Sophie, who had worn it every day of the 2 years they'd spent together. Sophie, who had disappeared from his life in circumstances he'd never fully understood, taking with her everything that had made him believe in the possibility of happiness. Sophie, who would be 28 years old now. Sophie, who he had never stopped looking for. He gripped the edge of the counter with both hands. His mind was doing rapid, violent calculations, things he wasn't ready to calculate, conclusions he wasn't ready to reach. His breath was unsteady. The little girl was still watching him with those wide dark eyes, her small hand curved protectively around the pendant as if she'd felt a stare and instinctively wanted to guard it. "Hi," she said again, patiently, as though she had all the time in the world and was prepared to greet him as many times as it took. From the hallway outside the kitchen, he heard footsteps. Light, quick, a woman's footsteps. And then the kitchen door swung open, and a young woman stepped inside carrying a stack of folded linens, dark-haired, 28 years old, with a face that had 7 years of hardship written in its careful composure. She looked up. She saw him, and whatever color had been in her face drained out of it instantly, leaving behind something that looked exactly like the truth. "Ethan," she whispered. Not Mr. Hargrove. Not Sir. His name, the way only one person in the world had ever said it, like it was something she'd been holding in her mouth for years, waiting and terrified of the moment she'd have to let it out. His world didn't just shift. It collapsed. Every wall, every carefully constructed stone.
"Down."
"Sophie," he said, and his voice broke on the word like it had been waiting 7 years to do exactly that. The linens fell from Sophie Reyes's arms in slow motion, a cascade of white cotton unfolding onto the kitchen floor that neither of them moved to pick up. Lily, sensing the change in atmosphere with the animal instinct of small children, went very still between her plastic animals and looked from her mother to the tall man and back again, reading the air the way children do when they know something large is happening even if they can't name it. Sophie's mind was doing something she hadn't allowed it to do in years. It was remembering, and remembering, she had learned, was the most dangerous thing a person could do when they'd built their entire survival on the act of forgetting. She remembered the night she'd left. March, 7 years ago. She'd been 21, newly discovered to be pregnant, and standing in the lobby of the Hargrove family's Boston townhouse, holding a note she'd never delivered and a secret she'd convinced herself was better carried alone. She'd told herself she was protecting him. She'd told herself that a man like Ethan Hargrove, heir to a dynasty, already shouldering his father's failing health, already being circled by board members and lawyers and the crushing machinery of legacy, Didn't need one more complication. Didn't need a 21-year-old girlfriend with no family money, no connections, and a pregnancy that would turn his carefully managed world into a tabloid story. She told herself so many things that night. Standing in the cold marble lobby, she'd constructed an entire architecture of reasons, each one reasonable on its own. Each one, she now understood. A brick in a wall she was building to hide the truth. She was afraid. Afraid he wouldn't choose her. Afraid that if she gave him the chance and he didn't, it would destroy something in her that couldn't be rebuilt. So she had left without giving him the chance at all. She'd gone to her aunt in Hartford, Mrs. Patterson's sister, a fact she'd kept carefully compartmentalized, telling her aunt only that she'd left a relationship and needed a fresh start. She'd had Lily in a hospital room alone, holding her own hand through the worst of it, and when the nurse had placed that small, dark-haired, already serious baby on her chest, Sophie had made a promise out loud to the empty room. I will be enough. I will be everything she needs. She had spent 3 years making that promise true through sheer, grinding, exhausting force of will. And now she was standing in his kitchen. His kitchen. The universe, apparently, had a cruel and exquisite sense of timing. I didn't know, she said, because it was the first thing she could form into words. That this was your house. My aunt arranged it. I never would have, she stopped. Even to her own ears, she sounded like someone explaining themselves before they'd been accused of anything, which was its own kind of confession. Ethan hadn't moved. He was still gripping the counter, still staring at her, and the look on his face was something she hadn't been prepared for. She'd imagined, in the dark hours over 7 years, various versions of what his face would look like if she ever saw him again. She'd imagined anger. She'd even, in her most self-punishing moments, imagined indifference, the cool, distant look of a man who had simply moved on and found her absence unremarkable. She had not imagined this. She had not imagined a face that looked like a man watching something he'd given up on come back from the dead. Sit down, he said. His voice was quiet and careful, the voice of someone carrying something fragile. Please. Ethan. Sophie. He said her name again, and it was different this time. Less broken, more deliberate. Please. Just sit down. She sat. Lily immediately climbed into her lap, and Sophie wrapped both arms around her daughter's small body like armor. Ethan moved around the island and lowered himself into the chair across from them. He was looking at Lily now, really looking, with the focused intensity of a man putting together a calculation he can't quite bring himself to complete. How old is she? He asked. Quietly, as though the question cost him something. Sophie closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them, she looked directly at him because she owed him that. She had taken so much from him without his knowledge. She could at least give him the truth while looking him in the eye. 3, she said. She'll be 4 in June. She watched the math move through him. She watched him count backward, because of course he did. He was the sharpest mind she'd ever known, and she watched his face do something complicated and immense that he was trying very hard to keep composed. June, he repeated. He was looking at Lily with an expression that Sophie recognized, because she'd worn it herself every single day for 3 years, complete and helpless love. He was looking at her daughter the way you look at something you didn't know you needed until you're standing directly in front of it. Her name is Lily, Sophie said, because the silence was becoming impossible. Lily Sophie Reyes. Something moved across Ethan's face at the middle name, a flinch, almost, but softer. He looked up from Lily to Sophie, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. In the corner, one of Lily's plastic animals toppled over, the tiny orange giraffe, and Lily twisted in her mother's arms to look at it with grave concern. Raph fell down, she reported seriously. I see that, baby, Sophie murmured. Ethan reached over, slowly, giving her time to stop him if she wanted to, and set the giraffe back on its feet. Lily watched this operation with great attention. Then she looked up at him with her dark, evaluating eyes. Thank you, she said, with a careful pronunciation of a child who has been well taught. You're welcome, Ethan said. And his voice, for the first time in years, was completely unguarded, raw and open and real. He cleared his throat. He looked back at Sophie. And the question he needed to ask was sitting between them so heavily that the whole room felt weighted with it. Is she mine? He asked. Not with anger. Not with accusation. With the voice of a man who has been surviving on nothing for 7 years and is almost afraid to find out there was something waiting for him the whole time. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. She was furious at herself for crying. She nodded. Once. And then the word, small and enormous. Yes. Ethan Hargrove, who had sat across from presidents and billionaires and never once looked uncertain, pressed his hand over his eyes and breathed. Just breathed. The sound of it filled the kitchen, ragged and human, and the most honest thing Sophie had heard in 7 years. Sophie had become an expert in the geography of alone. She knew its terrain intimately, the particular silence of a Tuesday evening when Lily was asleep and the apartment was quiet and there was no one to tell the small things to, the funny things, the things that would have meant nothing to anyone but would have meant everything to the right person. She knew the weight of a grocery cart managed with one hand while the other held a toddler. She knew the arithmetic of a monthly budget, so precise it left no room for error. Not a single unexpected expense, a doctor visit, a broken shoe, a fever that required a day off work, without cascading consequences. She had never once, in 3 years, allowed herself to frame it as tragedy. Lily was not a tragedy. Lily was the best thing Sophie had ever done. But the doing of it alone, the relentless, grinding, beautiful, exhausting doing of it alone, had left its marks. They were in the careful way she moved through the world, always calculating, always weighing. They were in the way she never let Lily see her cry. They were in the calluses on her hands from work that was physical and constant, and the small crease between her brows that hadn't been there at 21. After that first morning in the kitchen, after the confession that hung in the air between them like something still falling, Ethan had done something she hadn't expected. He hadn't made demands. He hadn't called lawyers. He hadn't performed the kind of controlled, powerful anger she'd braced herself for. He'd asked, very quietly, if she would stay. Just for the day. So they could talk. So he could understand. She had stayed. Mrs. Patterson, who turned out to have suspected far more than she ever let on, had discreetly taken Lily to explore the gardens while Ethan and Sophie sat at the kitchen table and did the hardest thing 2 people can do, tell each other the truth about the past. Sophie told him everything. She told him about the lobby, the note she'd never delivered, the architecture of fear she'd dressed up as selflessness. She didn't soften it or justify it. She laid it out plainly because she had learned, in 3 years of building a life with no cushion and no pretense, that plain truth, even when it's ugly, is the only foundation that holds. Ethan listened. He was extraordinarily good at listening. She'd forgotten that about him. He'd always had the quality of making you feel that what you were saying was the most important thing happening anywhere in the world. He listened to all of it, and when she was finished, the silence stretched between them, and she waited for what she deserved. He said, I looked for you. 2 months after she'd disappeared, he told her. He'd hired people to find her. Not to make demands. He was careful to say that, careful to make her understand his intentions, but because she'd vanished so completely, so cleanly, that he'd been terrified something had happened to her. They'd turned up nothing. He'd looked for a year. And then his father had gotten worse, and the company had needed him, and grief had stacked upon grief until looking became something he simply couldn't sustain any longer. I thought he stopped. Started again. I thought you'd made your choice, and I had to respect it, even if I didn't understand it. Sophie looked at her hands. I was so sure I was doing the right thing. Were you? No anger in it. Genuine question. I was so sure I was a complication you didn't need. She looked up at him. I've had 3 years to understand that I was doing what frightened me the least. I called it protecting you. It wasn't. There was a long quiet. Through the window, they could see the gardens, and in the gardens, a small dark-haired figure toddling determinately through the hedgerows while Mrs. Patterson followed at a careful distance, and both of them, without meaning to, watched Lily for a long moment and didn't speak. Tell me about her, Ethan said softly. Not as an accusation. As a man who had missed 3 years he couldn't get back and was trying to begin the work of understanding what he'd missed. So Sophie told him about Lily. She told him about the way Lily had come into the world loud and opinionated and had never once stopped being exactly that. She told him that Lily had said her first word at 9 months, more, naturally, and had walked at 11 months and had gone directly from walking to something approaching a run with absolutely no interest in the cautious middle ground. She told him that Lily was obsessed with animals, real and plastic alike, and could identify 17 different species by sight, and had very strong opinions about the correct order of her bedtime books. She told him that Lily was kind, extraordinarily, instinctively kind in the way some children just are, the way it seems like a feature of their factory setting, and that strangers in grocery stores regularly stopped Sophie to say something about Lily's eyes, which were Ethan's eyes, dark and serious, and somehow both evaluating and warm at once. Sophie hadn't planned to talk so long. She hadn't planned to cry either, but somewhere in the middle of talking about Lily's first birthday, a tiny party in their small Hartford apartment, just Sophie and her aunt, with a single candle on a grocery store cupcake, the tears came, quiet and unbidden, and she didn't bother trying to stop them. Ethan reached across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, she could see him weighing whether he had the right. He placed his hand over hers, not gripping it, just resting there, present. She sounds extraordinary, he said. She is, Sophie said. She is the most extraordinary person I have ever met. And she deserved, her voice broke. She steadied it. She deserved to know you. From the beginning. I took that from her. I took it from both of you. And I have to live with that. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, you were 21 and terrified. And you were alone. He paused. I'm angry.
I want to be honest with you about that.
There's going to be a part of this that I have to work through. He looked at her steadily. But I don't want to be angry. I want to figure out what comes next. It was, Sophie thought, the most Ethan Hargrove sentence she had ever heard. Practical and honest and forward-looking, even in the middle of a detonation. She had forgotten in 7 years how much she had loved the specific, particular way his mind worked. She had not forgotten how much she had simply loved him. That, she was realizing, was something she had not managed to set down. What nobody had anticipated was Lily. Lily, who had no investment in the complexity of adult histories and past heartbreak and the careful negotiations of 2 wounded people trying to find their footing, had encountered Ethan Hargrove with the radical simplicity of a 3-year-old who had decided, within approximately 4 minutes of genuine interaction, that she liked him. It had started with the giraffe. The setting upright of the fallen giraffe had evidently registered in Lily's accounting as an act of significant merit, and she had, after Mrs. Patterson's garden tour, returned to the kitchen to find Ethan still sitting at the table and walked directly up to him and presented him with the giraffe. His name is Gerald, she informed him. Ethan had accepted Gerald with appropriate solemnity. That's a good name. Lily had studied him for a moment with the evaluating expression that Sophie privately thought of as Lily's courtroom face. Do you have animals? Not plastic ones, he admitted. Lily considered this. We can share, she said, and this was, Sophie knew, the highest honor in Lily's gift-giving economy, because Lily did not share her plastic animals with just anyone.
She had a whole protocol around it.
After that, Lily had simply incorporated Ethan into her morning the way children incorporate new objects into their play, seamlessly, without ceremony, as though the universe had simply corrected an oversight. By 10 o'clock, Ethan Hargrove, who had spent 7 years becoming progressively more removed from warmth and spontaneity and the unpredictable, was cross-legged on the kitchen floor helping a 3-year-old build what she called a zoo house, out of a shoebox Mrs. Patterson had located and some markers and an ambitious quantity of tape. Sophie stood in the doorway and watched and felt something terrible and wonderful happening in her chest simultaneously. He was natural with her. That was the thing that undid Sophie most completely. She had worried, in the fragmented way she'd thought about this scenario over the years, that Ethan would be formal and distant with a child. He was a man who had grown so accustomed to distance. But there was nothing distant about the way he listened when Lily explained the rules of the zoo house, or the way he held the shoebox steady while she taped a cotton ball cloud to the top of it, or the way he asked questions, real ones, not condescending ones, about which animals should go in which enclosure and why. Gerald lives here, Lily said, placing the giraffe in a corner with proprietary certainty. Because he likes to see the door. In case he needs to leave quickly? Ethan asked. Lily looked at him with the expression she used for people who had just demonstrated unexpected insight. Exactly, she said. Sophie pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at the ceiling. In the afternoon, Ethan took them into the gardens. Sophie had tried to protest, tried to retreat back into the role of employee and leave the equation, and Ethan had simply said, "Please stay," in a voice that made arguing feel pointless. The March air was cold but brilliantly clear, the kind of afternoon that felt like a promise, and Lily ran ahead of them along the garden paths with the focused energy of someone who has been presented with an entirely new world and intends to investigate every inch of it. Ethan walked beside Sophie, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, not quite touching, maintaining the careful distance of two people who had once been close and were now renegotiating the map. But he was watching Lily with an expression that Sophie had no name for, something between wonder and anguish, something that was still becoming itself. "She's really mine," he said. Not a question. Just a man saying a thing out loud to make it real. "She's really yours," Sophie confirmed softly.
He was quiet for a while.
Then, does she know? About her father? Sophie swallowed. "I told her that her daddy loved her, but wasn't with us. That someday she would understand more." She glanced at him. "I couldn't. I didn't want to tell her you didn't exist." That felt like a worse lie. Ethan nodded slowly. Ahead of them, Lily had found a stone bench and was climbing it with great determination and no regard for safety, and Ethan moved forward automatically and positioned himself beside it without being asked, hands ready, not interrupting her climb, but present for it. Lily reached the top, stood up triumphantly, and looked out at the gardens with the satisfaction of a conqueror. "I can see everything," she announced. "What do you see?" Ethan asked her. She pointed.
"Trees."
"And that bird." "And Mama." She considered. "And you." She looked down at him with her serious dark eyes. "What's your name?" Sophie's heart stopped. Ethan looked up at Lily. In that pause, Sophie saw him weighing something enormous and choosing his words with the care of a man who understands that some moments cannot be undone. "My name is Ethan," he said. Lily tasted it. "Ethan," she repeated. She nodded once, apparently satisfied. Then she held out her hand for him to help her down, which he did, and when her small feet were back on the ground, she kept holding his hand and said, with the stunning matter-of-factness of 3-year-olds, "Okay, Ethan, come see the bird." He looked back at Sophie over Lily's head, and the expression on his face was one she had to look away from, because it was too much, too open, too enormous, too full of the 3 years he hadn't been there for, and the future he was just now beginning to understand was possible. He let a 3-year-old lead him across a garden to look at a bird. And Sophie stood in the cold March afternoon watching the two of them, their dark heads bent together over a sparrow on a branch, and quietly, privately, fell apart in the best possible way. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. Sophie had lived long enough and worked hard enough to be appropriately suspicious of things that looked too easy, and she did not trust easy. What happened between her and Ethan in those weeks was not easy. It was honest, which is harder than easy and better than it. Ethan had asked, very carefully and without pressure, if she would let him be part of Lily's life. He hadn't framed it as a demand or a right, even though his lawyers, whom she knew he had consulted, because he was nothing if not thorough, could have translated it into exactly that. He'd framed it as a request, as something he was asking of her, not taking from her. That mattered. It mattered enormously.
She'd said yes.
The logistics were unglamorous and necessary. Lawyers, yes, but collaborative ones. Paperwork that established Lily's paternity and Ethan's parental rights in terms that protected both of them, without punishing either. Sophie had moved, with Lily, from her small Hartford apartment to a comfortable house 20 minutes from the Hargrove estate. Not on his property, she'd been firm about that, needing the specific dignity of her own address, but close enough that Lily could spend time with him on a real and regular schedule. The first morning Ethan came to pick Lily up alone, just him, no staff, a man who had never done an errand for himself in years showing up at her door with a car seat he'd installed incorrectly and then corrected by watching 3 YouTube tutorials. Sophie had stood in her doorway and watched them walk to his car and felt fear and hope in such equal measure that they'd canceled each other out into something that felt almost like peace. He made mistakes. He was learning an entirely new language, the language of a 3-year-old, and he made the mistakes of someone learning. He bought Lily a gift on their 3rd outing that was too overwhelming and too much, the kind of gift a man buys when he's trying to compensate with money for time he didn't get to spend, and Lily had been more interested in the box than anything inside it, and Sophie had gently told him afterward that what Lily wanted from him was not things but presents, and he had listened without defending himself and had not done it again. He showed up. That was the thing. Every scheduled day, every agreed-upon time, he showed up. Not with grand gestures. With consistency. With the understanding that love at the level where it actually counts is mostly just showing up reliably and paying attention. Sophie watched this, and it did something to the part of her that had spent 3 years surviving by not trusting anyone else's follow-through. They were careful with each other. The history between them was real, both what they'd had and what she'd taken from him, and they handled it with the care that real things require. There were hard conversations. There were evenings when Lily was asleep, and they sat in Sophie's small kitchen with tea and the particular, loaded quiet of 2 people who have unfinished business and are choosing to finish it honestly. He told her what her leaving had done to him. He said it plainly, without cruelty, but plainly because he deserved to say it and she deserved to hear it. He told her that he'd spent a year looking, and then years after that wondering what he'd done or hadn't done, and that the wondering had made him harder and more isolated in ways he was only now beginning to map. She listened the way he'd listened to her, without defense, without redirection, just taking it in. "I'm sorry," she said, when he'd finished. Not as a performance of sorry, as the actual truth. "I am sorry for what I took from you." He looked at her for a long time. "I know," he said. And then, I'm not here to hold it over you. I'm telling you because I want you to understand me. Where I've been. Where I'm still working through.
Okay, she said.
Okay, he said. And somewhere in those careful, honest, unglamorous weeks, things began to shift. Not dramatically. Not with the sweeping cinematic clarity of a grand romantic gesture. With the gradual, real, hard-won quality of something that had survived weather and was still standing. He started texting her things about Lily, small observations, the funny things she said, photos from their afternoons together. At first, she held her responses carefully, maintaining the appropriate emotional distance of a co-parenting arrangement. But he was funny in his texts. He'd always been funny in a dry, unexpected way that she'd loved, and it was disarming in the same way it always had been, and eventually she stopped being careful about it and just texted back. One evening, after Lily was returned home and tucked in and the small house was quiet, Ethan texted, "She told me today that Gerald the giraffe is lonely and needs a girlfriend giraffe. I've been informed this is urgent." Sophie wrote back, "She's been running this giraffe girlfriend campaign for 2 months. Don't let her fool you with the urgency."
A pause.
Then, too late. I went to 3 stores.
Her name is Geraldine.
Sophie sat in her kitchen with her phone and laughed. A real laugh, sudden and full, the kind she hadn't produced in years. And somewhere in the middle of it she understood that something in her had already decided, that her heart, which she'd thought she'd locked away safely, had been quietly making its way back to him for weeks. It was a Saturday in late May when it happened, not with a speech, not with a ring, not with any of the trappings that stories like to attach to the moment things become permanent. It happened in Sophie's backyard, which was a modest backyard by any standard, with a small lawn and a lilac bush that had started blooming and a second-hand patio table that wobbled if you set anything heavy on the left corner. Ethan had come over that morning, as he did on Saturdays now, and he'd brought coffee and a bag of those particular pastries from the Hartford bakery that Lily had decided were the correct pastries, and the 3 of them had ended up in the backyard because Lily insisted, and May was obliging them with the kind of morning that makes you forgive winter completely. Lily was chasing the one slow bee that had decided to investigate the lilac bush, narrating her pursuit in real time with commentary that mostly concerned Gerald and Geraldine the giraffes, whom she'd brought outside and positioned on the patio table as spectators. Ethan was in one of the wonky chairs with his coffee, watching her, and Sophie was in the other chair, and they were talking, not about anything important, just talking, the way 2 people talk when they've become comfortable enough to speak without weight, when Lily suddenly stopped chasing the bee and turned around and looked at them with her courtroom face. "Are you Mama's friend?" she asked Ethan. He looked at Sophie. Sophie felt the question land in her chest like something placed there gently. "I am," Ethan said. Lily considered this. "A good friend? I'm trying to be," he said seriously. "I'm working on it." Lily nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. Then she said, with the precision of someone who has clearly been thinking about something for a while, "My friend Emma has a daddy who comes to her house. He fixes things." She paused. "Our sink drips." Sophie closed her eyes briefly. Ethan said, "I could look at it." "You don't have to," Sophie started. "I want to," he said. He was looking at her now, not at Lily, and the look was the kind that has whole conversations inside it. "I want to look at the sink. I want to fix the things that drip." He paused. "Sophie, I want to be here. Not just for her. For both of you. If you'll let me try." The lilac bush smelled extraordinary in the May morning air. Lily had resumed her bee pursuit, apparently satisfied that the important question had been asked and answered, and the adults could handle the rest. A bird was doing something musical in the maple tree by the fence. The wobbling table held its coffee cup steady. "I don't need you to fix things," Sophie said quietly. "I've been fixing things." "I know," he said. "I know you have. You've done Everything. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, holding his coffee with both hands and looking at her with the directness that had always been one of his most disarming qualities. I'm not offering to rescue you. You don't need rescuing. I'm asking you to let me stand next to you. Entirely different proposition. Sophie looked at this man, 33 years old, carrying 7 years of his own particular grief, sitting in a second-hand patio chair in her modest backyard because her daughter had wanted to chase a bee, and he'd followed without complaint. She thought about the careful weeks behind them, the hard conversations, the way he showed up, the way he'd sat on her kitchen floor and learned the taxonomy of plastic animals and asked real questions and listened to the answers. She thought about Gerald and Geraldine, currently propped against a coffee cup as official bee-chasing spectators. The sink drips on the left side, she said. Under the handle. He smiled, and it was the smile she remembered, full and unguarded, the one that had always made him look like a completely different person than the composed, careful face he showed the world. It transformed his face the way the sun transforms a morning, and she had missed it with an acuteness she hadn't let herself measure until right now. I'll need tools, he said. I don't actually know how to fix a sink, but I'll learn. She laughed. That's very honest. I'm going to be very honest with you, he said, for the rest of whatever this is. As a baseline policy. Good policy, she said. Lily came running back across the grass, having concluded her bee-chasing operation, and threw herself without warning into Ethan's lap with the absolute physical confidence of a child who has decided someone is safe. He caught her automatically, steadied her, and she looked up at him and said, "The bee flew away." Tragic. Bees do that, he said. Gerald says it's okay, Lily decided, and reached over to pat the giraffe on the table, reassuring it or herself or both. Ethan looked over her dark curls at Sophie. She looked back at him. The morning sat around them, the lilac, the bird, the May light falling over a small and ordinary backyard, and it was the most complete thing Sophie had felt in 7 years. Not perfect, not resolved of all its complicated history, but whole. The way things are whole when all the missing pieces have finally been returned to the table, even if it took longer than it should have, even if the path back was crooked and cost more than it needed to. Stay for lunch, she asked. Stay for lunch, he agreed. Lily slid off his lap and went back to her animals with great purpose, the bee already forgotten, the morning already reorganizing itself around whatever came next. She picked up Gerald, inspected him, set him next to Geraldine, and nodded with satisfaction. Gerald is happy, she announced to no one in particular. Sophie reached across the wobbly table and Ethan met her hand halfway, not dramatically, not as a culmination, just two hands finding each other in the ordinary daylight of a Saturday morning, which is exactly where the real things happen. They stayed for lunch, and then through the afternoon. And by evening, when Lily was asleep in her bed with Gerald and Geraldine standing guard on her nightstand, the pendant gleaming softly in the low light, that crescent moon, that chip of blue topaz, the small gold thing that had started all of this, the house was quiet and full in equal measure. Some things find their way back. Not in spite of the years, not in spite of the distance and the grief and the cost of it all, but carrying all of that, shaped by all of that, return not as what they were before, but as something harder and more honest, and for exactly that reason, more capable of lasting. That is, when you look clearly at it, what love actually is. The end.